Now that I'm a good few weeks into my reviews of Transformers Prime, I feel like it's about time that I talked about Prime's sequels, or rather the sequels to the aligned continuity of which Prime was the flagship series. And yes, I did say sequels. Prime as a series has 2 sequels, one of which is only just getting started, known as Transformers Cyberverse, which I will actually be talking about next week. I have mentioned many times now how much I like Prime as a series overall, so you can imagine when it ended, I was pretty bummed out. When I heard that it was getting a sequel, though, I was cautiously optimistic, especially when they announced that that sequel was going to be more upbeat and child-friendly. Now, as someone who never really thought Prime wasn't child-friendly, that stuck out to me. Yes, Prime had some mature messages in it, but you guys know how much of an advocate I am for shows which grow up with their target audience, shows which have layers to them, that their target audience can go back and rewatch the show later and catch those layers for the first time as they mature. I always saw Prime as that kind of show, and announcing that its sequel, Robots in Disguise, was going to be more kid-friendly told me that it probably wasn't going to have those layers. But then more stuff about the concept started to drop, and I started to get a little more excited. An entire series focusing on Bumblebee as the leader of a new Autobot team centered on Earth, giving Prime Bumblebee that chance to show that he really is the worthwhile successor to Optimus Prime. Yes, please. One of my favorite Transformers characters ever in my favorite color? Yes, please. I still didn't expect it to be as good as Prime was. Other things I was reading about it told me that it wasn't going to be as good as Prime was, but I was at least a little hyped. So I sat down to watch the series when it first aired, and it was alright. The show has a premise of Bumblebee leading a group of misfit Autobots in a quest to recapture Cybertronian villains who escaped stasis lock when their prison ship crashed on Earth. This, as I'm sure you can imagine, lends itself to a Monster of the Week sort of formula very easily, and that is what the show slipped into. Which is absolutely fine. It gave the character designers on the show the opportunity to really show off some different sorts of Transformers characters. Minicons were introduced to the aligned continuity. We got to see guys with beast modes for the first time outside of the various Predacons that we saw later on in Prime. And we even got to see more guys with pseudo-beast modes, with robot modes with beast traits, kind of like Arachnid. And despite the more kid-friendly, upbeat tone, there was some conflict among members of the team. This version of Grimlock, for example, was a Decepticon who decides to side with Bumblebee and his ragtag Autobots. So he has kind of this quest for redemption thing going on in the background. There was a lot to like here, but it was still only okay. There have been better Transformers series, and Prime was definitely one of them. Hence, this did not live up to its predecessor. And that's fine, it didn't really need to. Prime still exists. It's not as if this series negates the existence of that one. This series not being quite as good doesn't detract from Prime being so great. It doesn't bother me that this just isn't quality-wise as good a series, because it's still an enjoyable series to watch. What really bothers me the most about Robots in Disguise is all of the missed opportunities to tie it back into stuff from Prime. Really quickly, I want to point out that there are going to be spoilers in this video for parts of Transformers Prime that I haven't reviewed yet. RID, at the very least, did remember that Megatron at the end of Prime stopped being a Decepticon. He decided he didn't want to be a Decepticon anymore, and he disbanded the faction. So every Decepticon that exists now is a rogue Decepticon. A Transformer who has made a personal choice to keep with the mentalities of the Decepticons, despite the fact that the faction doesn't technically exist. And because the series did remember that, they remembered not to make Megatron the villain again. So we did get a chance to see alternate villains, but the first main villain of the show just wasn't very good, and he had the spotlight completely stolen from him by the second one. He hardly got a chance to do anything meaningful at all. He had a cool design and he had a cool presence, but he was just such a letdown by the end of his arc. They really stepped things up with the second main villain of the series and the whole arc that came along with him. And then the final arc of the show was actually pretty solid. It still wasn't as good as Prime was, even in its worst, but it was better. It was a lot better than what we had gotten before. There was a lot of mystery and intrigue, and it actually felt like something more in tone with Prime, just a slightly more upbeat version of Prime. New characters were introduced over the course of the series, and there were returning characters from Prime who slipped right into the story pretty effortlessly, but they always felt like they weren't meant for this show. Keeping them accurate, keeping them in line with their characterization from Prime, they felt out of place. Like they worked for the stories that were being told, but they didn't feel like they belonged here. Even Bumblebee at times didn't feel like he belonged in this show. He felt like he belonged in a show more in line with Prime's tone. But as they added more characters and as they brought in guest characters, the character dynamics got more complex and interesting, with those character dynamics actually culminating in an arc where the Autobots had to learn to combine together. Obviously, combination is a thing in Transformers. We never really saw it in Prime, but it's still a thing in Transformers and in the aligned continuity. But to have Bumblebee's group of Autobots specifically have to learn how to combine together, that was super interesting. It became sort of an ongoing collective character arc, and I hadn't really seen something like that done in a kids show before. These characters had to learn to work flawlessly as a unit without sacrificing who they were as people, and it worked. It worked surprisingly well. The toys that came out of it were absolute garbage, but the arc worked really well. This also led to some absolutely fantastic combiner names, my favorite of which is B-Side, the combination of Bumblebee and Sideswipe. While we're on the subject of Sideswipe, though, and reminding you that there is a spoiler warning on this video for Prime. While I don't dislike Sideswipe as a character, he does bring up one of my other issues with this series. There is one Prime character in particular who I feel should have gotten the spotlight in this show, and that is Knockout, who, for those of you who don't know, does eventually change sides and become an Autobot. It happens at the very end of the series, and there is no opportunity for him to develop into a true Autobot before Prime ends. And seeing as how Bumblebee's entire team is made up of misfits in the first place, he should have been one of them. And I honestly think he could have taken the place of Sideswipe in this story with absolutely nothing changing, except that we would have lost the name B-Side, which would admittedly have bummed me out. I mean, think about this for a second. Here's the description of Sideswipe according to the Transformers wiki. Rebel, bad boy, competitive, these are all things that describe Sideswipe, who is always happy to show off his prowess in the heat of battle. Sideswipe is, at his core, a lone wolf who tends to look out for himself, but when push comes to shove, he heeds the call to action. Think about it for a second. RID takes place a few years after Prime, hence how Cybertronian civilization has built itself back up in the meantime. And also presumably why we don't bump into the human kids from Prime during the series either, as far as I remember, since they would have moved on with their lives at this point. Now imagine, during that passage of time, Knockout stopped thinking of the Autobots as the winning side, or the side less likely to shoot him if he's mildly annoying. And he started to think of them as the good side, the side most capable of doing some good for Cybertron and its people, and he's realized that he likes that. So now his desire to be a good Autobot is conflicting with his core nature. Now take that description that I just read and switch out a few details and tell me it couldn't describe that version of Knockout, giving this character who made this heel face turn at the last possible second a chance to really justify that choice and show that he is a true Autobot. There's even this overarching subplot where Sideswipe and Team Straight Razor Strongarm clash because Sideswipe is such a rebel. Couldn't you see them clashing because of Knockout's past if this were Knockout in the role instead of Sideswipe? It just feels like such a wasted opportunity, and I guess that's really just what RID comes down to in my mind, is a wasted opportunity. Again, it's a perfectly enjoyable Transformers show, but unlike Prime, this isn't a show that I would recommend to anyone who likes superhero action or sci-fi. This is a show that I would recommend to people who like Transformers enough to overlook the faults in a show because it's a Transformers show. It's an enjoyable Transformers show, and it's a safe Transformers show. But because of that, it misses so many opportunities. It misses so many opportunities to be the worthwhile follow-up to a much better property. And so, no matter how good it got by the end, no matter how much good there was in it throughout, despite the fact that it actually did some really cool stuff like bringing fan-created character Windblade into a series for the first time, and developing her into a very likable character, or introducing the concept of the 13 Primes to a mainstream series and really fleshing them out for the first time, really fleshing out the idea for the first time. Despite the fact that it did those things, I can't help but always think of it as that series that missed so many opportunities. But that's just my 2 cents on the topic. I'd love to hear yours. What do you guys think of Transformers Robots in Disguise, the 2015 version? Because there was a version in like 2001 or something too. If you have seen it, let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below or over on my Discord, link in the description. But either way, this has been AJ22 and I will talk to you guys later.